Let me first say how grateful I am to have a chance to talk to you at this conference, which I consider to be the kind of conference we need to be having in countries all over the world. Whether we live here in the Rhone-Alps region or elsewhere in France or indeed elsewhere in the world, we have a responsibility as residents on this planet to act to save civilization. We all have a stake in the future of civilization. Most of us have children. Many of us have grandchildren. One of the things that we're facing today is the potential of a social fracturing along generational lines. We see social fracturing along racial and ethnic and religious lines. But if, for example, 3 years from now, scientists were to conclude that the melting of the Greenland ice sheet had reached the point of no return and we cannot save it, and we're therefore facing a 7-meter rise in sea level, what would the next generation say to us? They would say, why didn't you act? Why didn't you do something when there was still time? How could you leave us with a world of rising sea level and hundreds of millions of rising sea refugees, a world descending into chaos? We never faced a fractioning of civilization along generational lines before, but we could if we wait too long. Time is our scarcest resource. The problem is we don't know how much time we have. It is nature that determines these key thresholds, these tipping points in nature, if you will. Nature is the timekeeper, but we can't see the clock. So with that uncertainty, we have to move quickly to make sure the clock does not run out before we make the needed changes. When political leaders think about cutting carbon emissions, they usually begin with the question, what is politically feasible? And so they conclude we need to cut carbon emissions 80% by 2050. Within Europe, we now have the goals of cutting carbon emissions 20% by 2020 and increasing the renewable share of electricity generation to 20% by 2020. Now, those trends are clearly moving in the right direction. But if our goal is to save the Greenland ice sheet, if our goal is to protect the glaciers in the mountains of Asia, whose melting now represents the most massive threat to future food security of anything we've ever seen, then we've got to do much more than that. We think at the Earth Policy Institute, based on our analyses of these interacting factors of energy use and climate change and food security, that we have to cut carbon emissions 80% by 2020. And that's really more like a wartime mobilization. It's not going to be easy, but it's doable. Imagine if President Roosevelt had said after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, well, maybe it was a mistake. Let's wait and see if someone attacks us again, and then maybe we can go to war. There wasn't any of that. There was a very decisive response, and it changed literally the course of history. That's where we are today. We're faced with an enormous challenge, unlike any that we've faced before. We're talking about saving civilization, but it's not a spectator sport. It's not something where we can sit around and hope someone else does it while we watch. We all have to get involved. And that means not just changing our light bulbs and recycling our newspapers, though they're important. It means we have to change the system. It means we have to restructure the global economy, and that means becoming politically active. And that goes beyond just voting or taking part in presidential or parliamentary campaigns. It means organizing with your friends, with your colleagues on issues. Pick an issue that's important to you and go to work on it. Pick another issue. Make your community a model for recycling. Don't recycle just 20 or 30% of your garbage. Figure out how you can recycle everything. as an American environmentalist said, waste is the product of a poorly designed system. We shouldn't have any waste. We should emulate nature, where there is no waste. One organism's waste is another's sustenance. And that's how we need to be thinking about structuring the economy. So we have to restructure the system. And that means we need to get involved, each of us, in any way we can to accelerate this transition from what we academically call an unsustainable economy to one that is sustainable. 2 years from now, we will be reconvening this conference, and that will provide us a time in which we can measure progress in reaching our goals. Have we succeeded in reducing carbon emissions? Are we using less water today than we were 2 years ago? Are we reducing our dependence on fossil fuels? Are we reducing our dependence on imported oil? Are we recycling more of the raw materials that end up in garbage and landfills? These and many other criteria are the ones that we will be examining to see if, in fact, we are succeeding. Are we making substantial progress in our efforts to save civilization, or are we continuing to drift in the wrong direction? That's why I am personally looking forward to what happens over the next 2 years and what sort of reports we'll be able to make as this conference reconvenes 2 years later.